Hey everyone, welcome to New Perspectives on Qi and the Channels, a neurophysiological explanation of acupuncture. This is part one in a three-part series. This part will be looking at the history and development of Qi and the acupuncture channels. So the purpose of this is to lay the groundwork for the part two and part three, which we'll be visiting later on. We're going to be revisiting some of the basic concepts about acupuncture, about Qi and the philosophy, and how they have survived to the modern day and what they mean for us as acupuncture practitioners. How this influences our treatment approach and our TCM diagnosis, and basically what that means when, at the end of the day, we're applying a needle to somebody in order to help benefit their health. So we're going to be looking at the history and development. So if we just jump over to the contents here. In the introduction, we're just going to have a quick revisitation of what Qi and the channels are and what they mean. This is to benefit those of us who are TCM practitioners or acupuncture practitioners with a background in Chinese medicine, just to lay the foundations of what we're going to be working with here. It also benefits those of you who are not specifically TCM acupuncturists or Chinese medicine practitioners, just so you can get an understanding of what we're working with here to see the progression and understand why I have gone to the lengths that I have to try to explain the neurophysiological understanding of these traditional concepts that have been around for thousands of years, which are now really being explored by modern practitioners and modern medical science in an effort to understand why acupuncture does what it does and why it is effective. Not just to give an explanation to say, well, it's because there's Qi in a channel that we can't see and that's the best explanation we have for it. So that is ultimately the end goal of this, is to gain an understanding of how and why acupuncture does what it does, and comparing the modern understanding of it with the traditional understanding. Definitely not to disrespect or to say that these traditional concepts are wrong, but it's an effort to shed light on the marvel and the amazement of what the ancient Chinese really discovered, yet also trying to elucidate the things that are still mysterious in a hope to try to better understand what's actually going on. So with an end goal of improving our treatments and to help us to be better practitioners, have a better understanding of acupuncture on a whole. So what I'll be doing is going through the history and development of Qi and the channels, and then using the kind of modern understanding now of a pretty well-known, widely used text, at least in Australia, by a manual of acupuncture by Peter Deadman, and using that because that's kind of like a generic baseline for what we as acupuncture students, at least in Australia, it's like our first experience. That's our understanding. That's the book. I'm looking over there because it's in my my bookcase. So that's the baseline that I use, and then using those comparisons, I then use another textbook, which is Tutora and Derrickson, Principles of Anatomy and Physiology, and comparing the functions and the qualities of the acupuncture channels to the functions and the qualities of the systems in the human body, and drawing comparisons and contrasts to understand some, what was actually being discovered in a more traditional sense, which can now be compared to what has actually been proven as best we can so far in a medical science sense. So we're going to be looking at all of those comparisons and then come to some interesting conclusions at the end if we can, and hopefully we'll all learn something in the process. So off we go. So introduction, what are Qi and the channels? So the million-dollar question, what is Qi? Well, according to traditional Chinese medicine, it's one of the four vital substances. So we've got Qi, blood, body fluids, and essence. Now, if you're not a traditional Chinese medicine practitioner, it's a good idea to maybe do a bit of reading on this. I'm not going to go into it now, but essentially there's, the body's made up of vital substances, and qi is one of them. So according to traditional Chinese medicine, there are a range of different types of qi. Essentially, everything is made of qi. It's the vital force that keeps everything together. It's the glue that binds us, if you will. So in traditional Chinese medicine, we have a few different versions of qi. So one is de qi, which is the qi that we feel when we're inserting a needle into a point. We stimulate the point and we get a dull, heavy sensation. This is what is known as de qi. Then we've got organ qi. We've got blood, which is led by qi, and blood is the most condensed form of qi. There's yin and yang. So they're the complementary yet opposing forces that essentially define everything that come from this concept called the Tao, which can be likened to a void or something like that, from which all is spawned, to get very philosophical. Then we've got the Yi, the Zhi, the Han, the Po, and the Shen. So these are the 5 spirits that reside in our organs and determine our destiny, and also these 5 spirits are determined also by our health. They determine our health, and everything we do in life can either deplete our essence, essentially our life force from these 5 spirits, and maintaining the health of these 5 spirits will give us vitality and youth and allow us to live a long, healthy life to practice acupuncture. So a good quote to kind of sum it up is, "At the basis of all is qi. All other vital substances are but manifestations of qi in varying degrees of materiality. No one English word or phrase can adequately capture its meaning." So we can see that it's a pretty vital concept at the very heart of traditional Chinese medicine, yet conversely it's also can't properly be explained. So it's a bit of a mystery, in that it's the kind of cornerstone of our medicine as traditional Chinese medicine practitioners. Yet we're also, if we were to explain it, we can fall back on this thing of like, well, no one really knows what it is at the same time. So it's an interesting concept upon which to base a modern form of medicine. So here is a rendition of the physiology of qi according to traditional Chinese medicine, as depicted by me in one of my early years studying traditional Chinese medicine. If you're not an acupuncturist or a Chinese medicine practitioner, this will look very bizarre to you. But this is how qi is described, or the qi of the organs and the function of the organs within the body. It's actually quite, if you do learn about it, it's actually quite an amazing depiction of human physiology according to a traditional and ancient perspective. Of course, that's probably not what's happening in the body today, and my somewhat grotesque depiction of a human being exploded out in all different directions is probably a little bit off-putting to people who have studied more allopathic forms of medicine. But keep in mind that traditional Chinese medicine has a lot of philosophy, a lot of mythology that intertwined into it. It's such an old medicine, and with so many different authors of its narrative and its history, that a lot of concepts and kind of a romantic approach to the body gets tied in with it. So concepts like this remain. Once again, this is my depiction of it, but the ideas essentially still remain today. Is when you learn traditional Chinese medicine, you're exposed to these kinds of things, and you gain an understanding from this kind of philosophical perspective. Of course, this image with the other images will be available for you to check out later in your own time. So some modern concepts about what qi is that we've got all of these different approaches now. So one of them is that it's the bioelectric field. We've got the divine matrix concept, that we are one unified field of energy, and that we're all experiencing itself in subjectively through all of our individual life forms. So that's one very spiritual way of looking at it. There's also piezoelectricity, which is the energy stored in your body and generated by movement and friction within your physical body. Then there's the concept of nerve impulses. Is qi merely just electricity that is conducted by the opening and closing of ion channels in the body, and a conduction of the the millivolts of electricity to create action potentials? And is that what qi is? There are all different kinds of concepts, and to be frank about it, no one has decided upon which that is yet. And if all else fails, TCM practitioners tend to go back to the concept of in the traditional books and just say, well, look at the classics and that will tell you what qi is. But of course, as we saw before, it can be a little bit confusing. So what are the channels? Once again, many different concepts, many different ideas and perspectives on what the channels are. If we go back to traditional Chinese medicine, as we learn it, they are essentially conduits to transport qi and the vital substances. They also connect to the external, they connect the external body to the internal organs. So, as I said before, you've got the organs, and then in those organs you have your spirits, and then the channels are essentially your physical manifestation of your essence and your vital substances. And you can understand what's going on in the body because they will manifest in the channels. And you can also treat what is happening internally by needling the channels because they connect directly with the organs. So of course we've got all of the different types of channels. We've got the primary channels, which are the 12 channels that connect to the internal organs via internal channels. All channels are either yin or yang. Without getting into it, they're either yin or yang channels depending on which organ they're attached to. Then we've got lower connecting channels, which attach the yin channel to the yang channel. And vice versa. We've got sinew channels, which are basically muscle and fascia. Then we've got the 8 extraordinary channels or vessels, and there are other conceptual channels that link other channels together. You've got the Ren channel or the conception vessel down the front, and the governing vessel or the Du channel, which goes in the midline down the back. So a range of different channels. It is by virtue of the 12 channels that human life exists, that disease arises, that human beings can be treated and illness cured. So going back to what I said before, the channels are basically a manifestation of you as an individual. They are the physical presentation and through which all can be accessed. And in the style of Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, I've depicted here for you essentially what the channels look like. This is a basic rendition of what we as acupuncturists understand as the network through which the qi flows and the vital forces flow in the body. The thoughts about the channels these days are, once again, many and varied, much like the concept of qi. If you look into the classics of traditional Chinese medicine, you will find that there's a great deal of writing and many verses that basically depict the acupuncture channels as what they were, vessels, blood vessels. So we're talking about the arteries here that go around the body. We take the pulse in traditional Chinese medicine in a very different way to allopathic medicine, and through which we can understand what is going on in the body. And it makes sense that originally, many thousands of years ago, when these concepts were being generated and conceived, that the life force was felt within the vessels, and then that vessel was the very thing that you would be able to manipulate to get your vital force, qi, blood, moving. These days, the channels have a lot of different masks, a lot of different names, a lot of different concepts attached to them, such as the fact that they are energy pathways. They are lines of tension. So there's not that he says that they are acupuncture channels, what he depicts, but Tom Myers, with his anatomy trains, he talks about the lines of tension throughout the body, which people have read and attributed that to being a different version of the acupuncture channels. Then, of course, there's my favorite, which is the idea that the acupuncture channels are nerve pathways. So once again, there are a lot of different concepts as to what the acupuncture channels are. Still, no one seems to have decided upon exactly what they want to call them. The purpose of this course is to try to elucidate this, try to come to some understanding of what qi is and what the channels are. Are they some elusive concept that we're still trying to figure out today? Why is it after all this time people still, practitioners, many different fields from different fields of medicine, but also within the different fields of acupuncture itself, because there are different forms of acupuncture, nobody seems to have an exact, solid explanation as to what it is yet, which I think is, it can be positive and negative. I think it's good because it's the mystery is still there and we're still figuring it out. But it's also 2020, and I think it's about time we come to some conclusion as to what is actually going on. I don't think it's a big question to ask. I think with enough evidence and with enough research, hopefully which I can provide here, we can come to some kind of concrete understanding, or at least a little better understanding as to what we're actually working with here. So we're going to have a look at a brief history of the channels, qi, meridians, and energy. Now, the Chinese derived their understanding of the body based on the natural world around them and their perceived universe as opposed to concrete observations of anatomical facts. There was no study of the distribution of nerves or the origin and insertion of muscles. The ancient Chinese did not see the body as a form connected by a nervous system, but rather that an unbiased power in the form of qi shifted between the organs and parts of the human body. The relevance of nature and astrology in ancient Chinese philosophy was reflected in their comparison of the body to known planets, rivers, and calendar-based numbers. So, for example, the 4 limbs and the number of seasons. Wang Mang reported finding 5 zhang, liver, lungs, heart, spleen, and kidneys, corresponding to the 5 planets, 12 vessels circulating blood and air corresponding to the 12 rivers flowing towards the central kingdom, and 365 parts of the body, 1 for each day of the year. That one is implying that there are 365 parts to needle the body, and therefore the 365 acupuncture points. I found that quite surprising. I thought it was a bit coincidental when I first started learning about acupuncture points that there was that there were the same number of points on the body as there were days in the year. And then you start delving into this and you realize that it was done very much on purpose. I mean, there are so many extra points. I mean, essentially any point on the body, not on a primary channel, can be considered an extra point. You put a needle in it, it does something, and you found another acupuncture point. But there are the 365 primary points on the 12 primary channels. So the Earth has 4 seas in the east, south, west, and north. The human body must also have 4 seas, namely the sea of food, digestion, the sea of 12 meridians, so that's the sea of blood, the sea of qi, and the sea of marrow. As the ancient Chinese were a sophisticated irrigation culture, their observatory nature led them to make comparisons of the waterways of their crops to the flow of qi and blood through the conduits of the body. With such a heavy focus on agriculture, a body in good health was compared to a blooming flower, while the vessels were a metaphorical comparison of irrigation systems. So we can see what's going on here with how the ancient Chinese ran their society and then reflected what they knew of the world around them onto the human body. This was their way of understanding things. They compared the body to nature. China was at the center of the world, and at the center of China was the emperor. So therefore, the emperor becomes the quintessential element of all society. It's the very heart of everything. It's the center of the society, and the emperor is the direct connection to heaven. So this is why when you look at the organs, they all have different names attached to them from officials in charge of irrigation, in charge of the food and grain, and then you in the center of importance of all of these, the emperor, which was synonymous with the heart, in which the Shen, or the spirit, lives. So the lungs, heart, liver, spleen, and kidneys lie deep inside the body and are dedicated to the long-term storage of resources and are referred to as long-term depots. Small and large intestines, stomach, gallbladder, bladder, and sanjiao receive their stores today and relinquish them tomorrow, and are referred to as short-term repositories. So once again, this reflection of what's going on in Chinese society, in the village, in the farming life, in the irrigation, and reflected onto exactly, how they perceive what was going on in the body. Just like water must reach its crop to nurture the plant, blood and qi required an unimpeded passage to reach the location that it gave life to. Evil qi could also make use of these same systems of passage to cause harm to the body. By the early 3rd century BCE, the author of a passage in the Guanzhi compared water in the earth to blood and qi flowing through vessels in the human body. The Mawangdui manuscripts are silk scrolls upon which are scribed very old information about the origins of traditional Chinese medicine, in that it gives information about the original concepts of the vessels. So blood vessels are the obvious original referent of mai. So mai is the Chinese word for, or the Mandarin word, for vessel. As vessel theory developed, what held vapor was not clearly distinguished from what held blood. Now, talking about moxibustion, very briefly, it was regarded as the principal treatment in ancient China before the advent of acupuncture needles. This was due to the limited level of technology, meaning that the needles of the time were crafted from stone. So keep in mind that acupuncture that is practiced today really does not seem to have any real similarity to what was practiced in ancient China. We have surgical steel disposable needles created in a factory. The ancient Chinese had sharp stones with which they used to bleed their patients. So acupuncture consisted of bloodletting, incision, and drainage by the use of bian stones. Very different to the modern application of acupuncture, where half the time people don't even feel you're actually putting in needles. An important thing we need to remember about the ancient Chinese is that their society was, in the very early days, was governed by this concept of ancestor worship, where rituals were performed in order to appease the people that have, the family members that had passed on. And if things were not done in a very specific way, in a particular way, then the ancestors would come and basically wreak havoc on those that were still in the land of the living. So, as it says here, ancestor worship has long been a strong traditional influence throughout China's history. So if ancestors were not appeased with strict rituals performed by shamans, they could send calamity in the form of illness, failure of crops, floods, and drought. As ancestral worship declined, sickness became known to be caused by demonic and supernatural forces. Swellings caused by a demonic invasion could be pierced with stone lancets in an effort to expel them. Demonology heavily influenced early Chinese medicine and may have influenced the application of moxibustion, such as location according to the age of the patient and even time of day. I can't remember who actually told it to me, but it seemed fairly accurate. It seems like a pretty plausible explanation about moxibustion, in that it was akin to white sage or tobacco used by shamans by the native people of North America, who use white sage, and South America, who use tobacco, or mapacho it's called. So these are used by a shaman to ward off the evil spirits during a ceremony. So the smoke of the moxibustion would blind the demons, so they couldn't get a hold on you, and the smell of it was, the demons apparently found it repulsive, so they would steer clear. Kind of like garlic to vampires, that kind of concept. So I think it's an interesting, possibly true background as to part of the reason why they use moxibustion. I mean, if they're heavily influenced by the concept of demonology, then they would probably have developed some kind of way to put themselves at ease, that they would have, essentially a talisman to help ward off the evil spirits, so they didn't get a lock on them. So I'm trying to build a picture of the ancient Chinese here, in that the way they went about their daily life was very much based on the fact that they were prone to these demonic spirits or evil qi that would come in and basically invade the body through the channels, the same channels through which the vital force ran through the body. And if these channels were not fortified, if they weren't in good health, and this is how they would become ill. And the demonic possession of a person would then present in a form of sickness, be it from acute to extremely severe. I mean, you can imagine if someone had epilepsy or something like that, having seizures, and you don't know that it's caused by a misfiring of the synapses in the brain, and you see someone drop to the ground and start fitting. I mean, what are you going to think 2,000 years ago? What explanation do you have other than a demon has possessed my family member? You know, get the moxa out, start cutting things and get the bad blood out and get rid of the demons. I mean, it seems archaic to us, but that was the height of their medicine at the time. That the shaman was, they were the person. He or she was the center of the medicine. So I just want to paint that kind of picture of the mentality of where these concepts are actually coming from. This is where the idea of the channel and qi started, right? So the channels existed before the advent of acupuncture and the appearance of the 9-needle set in Ling Shu around 1155 CE, implying that sensations elicited by pressing on an area of the body were not the basis of the channels. Rather, that they were deeply rooted in the philosophical comparison of the human body to the phenomena of the natural world. So essentially what this author is depicting is that the concept of the channels were not defined by the experience of acupuncture, and it wasn't because of stimulating the body through Bjarnstone or pressure, whatever it was, gave rise to this concept of the channel. But rather that it was essentially based on the philosophy. Going back to that concept we were looking at before, that there were 12 rivers that flowed to the central kingdom. So therefore there must be 12 rivers of the body. Remember that these people were growing rice, a lot of rice. There was a lot of water around and a lot of irrigation. It's, you know, of course the body is going to be governed by the same kind of concepts if you're applying the idea of nature to how our own bodies work. So by the time the Su Wen was written during the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, the character Mai conveys two connected yet separate concepts. So one was the actual literal structure through which qi and blood was understood to move through. Remember a few slides back, it was not determined exactly whether it was blood or vapor that was flowing through these vessels. I'd like to point out that probably around the same time, I don't know exactly when it was, but over the other side of the world, the Greeks were determining what was inside the blood vessels, and they thought that they were full of air. Because when you cut someone open after they've been dead for a while, the blood isn't flowing anymore. Hence the name artery, which means air-filled. So this is kind of a common occurrence of early human to try to gain an understanding of what's going on in the body. And this is what we're presented with. I mean, no one's doing a lot of, no one's putting their hands up to cut bodies open to get a really good understanding about that, particularly not the Chinese. People in the West did that long before the Chinese were happily cutting people apart to understand what's going on inside the body. But this is the thing: you cut a blood vessel open, there's air in it. The Chinese are looking at this concept of an evilness that can interact with you, which is invisible, or a probably benign spirits as well that help you. And if these things are getting into the channel, it means that there's more than fluid in there. There's a kind of vapor or a spirit going on in your body as well. Not only extraneous or exogenous spirits, but also your own endogenous spirits as well. Remember, you've got the 5 spirits of the 5 yin organs. So before the turn of the millennia, the emphasis appeared to be more on the significance of blood rather than qi. Blood was considered not only as the liquid that could be seen leaving the body, but also as a physiological concept that conveyed the continual movement of blood and qi. So skip forward a bit, just going back to that second concept there about the attributes of movement that could be identified within or associated within the vessels to determine a vessel diagnosis. So this is looking at the movement of qi and blood in the body as a concept, not as an actual physical movement through vessels, but rather what those movements mean for you as a person as a whole. What's going on in your body and how you behave as a result of the movement of qi and blood throughout your body. So the idea of stagnant blood causing disease came from observing the qualities of flowing and stagnant water. So once again, going back to this concept of the rice fields, the Chinese looked at stagnant water that had stopped flowing, and one can assume that if water sits there for too long, it starts to go dank, things start, bugs start to form. Certainly in Australia, that's where mosquitoes like to procreate. And they took that as a sign that, well, if that's what's happening in nature, if the water stops and then, things clearly start to go murky and a bit rank, then that's probably what's happening in the body, because the fluid, i.e. the channels and the rivers in our body, have stopped flowing. They've dammed up and they've become stagnant. So, considering this, the vessels initially referred to conduits through which life force in the form of blood and qi flowed, and what could be felt pulsing through different regions of the body as an indicator for the vitality of a person. Despite the view that propagated sensations from applied pressure were not the basis of the channels, as needles were introduced, the practice would have become more so based on the sensations felt by the patient in response to the treatment. So despite what that author was saying before, that they disagreed with the concept that the channels came about by way of an interaction of a practitioner pressing on acupuncture points or pressure points, or using primitive needles to elicit a response, that wasn't the basis of the channels. It kind of makes sense that it's probably a good way as to how the actual channels would develop. Once again, if we strip the modern perspective of everything and go back to what the ancient Chinese the way that they viewed their world with a more primitive approach and a very naturalistic concept, if they see things flowing in nature, they see the wind going through the trees, they see water flowing through the rivers, they see the sun going through the sky and then the moon, and they've got the whole yin and yang concept of balance and everything like that. If they start pressing on points in the body which create sensations that travel down the arm or down the leg or throughout the body, then if they don't know what a nerve is, if they don't understand what the nervous system is, then what would you expect? What would you think as a practitioner or someone in receipt of the acupuncture treatment, if someone presses on part of your body and creates magical energetic sensations that travel to different parts of the body? You're not going to say, oh, that's just a basic nerve response of the body creating referral pain due to the pressure that you're pressing on my limb. Probably not. Considering that everybody was scared of their ancestors coming after them if they didn't appease them, they'd probably more likely think that there was some blockage in the rivers flowing in their body, and that was what was going on. It was some form of vital force, their qi, that was going through their body. I'd just like you to cast your mind back to ancient China, where they weren't doing a lot of dissections because they believed in ancestor worship, so therefore it was disrespectful to cut open dead bodies. Now, the few occasions where they did do that because someone was a criminal or a murderer or something like that, and they were probably tortured, the people that were doing the dissections or autopsies wouldn't have had a lot of understanding about what the human body was. They certainly would not have understood what nerves were. I mean, even in the practice of, when you study TCM today, there's no mention of the nerves. They're not a thing. They're not there. It's the channels do all of those functions. So if you consider that a physician is treating a patient and they're pressing on certain parts of their body, they're not knowing what the nervous system is, and then the patient is getting these interesting sensations that are traveling down the arm when you press a point up here, it's no surprise that an ancient people are going to think that there are these things called channels that are delivering the vital force throughout the body. It's a logical conclusion that that's what they would have thought. So it makes sense that that is one of the ways that the channels started to develop upon their original philosophy of the rivers flowing in the body. So, taking a pragmatic approach to the human experience and what we know of the minds of the ancient Chinese. As there was no knowledge of the functions of the nerves, we can picture the kinds of conclusions that ancient practitioners came to when they would press on a region of the body which would create strange referral sensations down a specific and repeatable region. So, as I said, what else can we expect? Having no intrinsic anatomical knowledge or understanding of the nervous system, physicians of the time had interwoven their objective and subjective experiences of the body with the phenomena of the natural world and philosophical constructs. The world moves to the rhythm of balance, seasons ebb and flow, day becomes night, water flows to an ultimate destination and becomes stagnant when it is still for too long. Why should the body be any different? We may assume that qi, despite its many diverse applications, always referred to a vague concept of finest matter believed to exist in all possible aggregate states, from air and steam or vapor to liquid and even solid matter. So we're getting this understanding that qi is essentially everything. You've either got qi moving at a very rapid, fast rate to create air and vapor, and then you've got qi moving at a very slow, condensed rate to create rocks on the earth, and the human body is in between. So during the Han Dynasty, the emphasis shifted from assessment based on the status of an individual's blood to that of their qi, and bloodletting treatments began to be replaced by needle application to influence the patient's qi flow. Possibly derived from an older concept of wind, qi became a way to explain physiological responses to pathogenic factors, environmental factors, an innate physiological necessity, and a potential harmful agent. It gave the ancient Chinese culture a new way to conceptualize causation and response. So now, perhaps with a new way to conceptualize the phenomena of the human body with this new idea of qi, coupled with the development of acupuncture needles and a more hands-on approach to treatment, physicians began to draw inferences about how this vital force moved throughout the body. Now that we've had a pretty good look at the origins of qi and the channels, where, may we ask, does the concept of qi being energy and the channels being meridians come from? It came from this guy, Georges Solier de Mauron, French diplomatic scholar who spent 21 years in China. He became introduced to acupuncture in 1905 during a cholera outbreak. He wrote a whole bunch of books, novels, and basically fell in love with acupuncture and brought it back to France. It's considered to be the architect of the success of acupuncture in France, and because of him, French doctors began to practice it in the 1930s. However, because he was translating the text from Chinese into French, what were originally referred in the ancient texts as vessels and qi, they were incorrectly translated by Mr. Solier de Mauron as meridians and energy at the start of the 20th century. Those ancient texts were translated from Chinese into French and then from French into English. And then, hey presto, in the modern day, we now have energy running through meridians. Meridians are invisible lines on the earth to tell you what time it is around the world, and energy comes in all shapes and sizes and is a completely inaccurate depiction of what qi is, as we've seen. Now, contemporary application of the ancient concepts. These next explanations are taken directly from a manual of acupuncture, the textbook that we are all acquainted with in the first year of our acupuncture degree. So I'm not going to go through every single line. You can go through the slides yourself and read them. I'll just summarize them. And we're using this as a basis to compare when we look at anatomy and physiology from the other textbook. So the first function of the channels is transporting qi and blood throughout the body and rendering the body an integrated whole. As I said before, they essentially allow the vital forces to go throughout the body. Number two is protecting the body. So the channels essentially act like a defense system, your immune system, to prevent the pathogenic or evil qi to get into the body and cause sickness. They respond to dysfunction in the body. So This is where any form of disease or pathology within the internal organs will present and manifest in the external channels or the primary channels on the exterior surface of the body. So the physician can have an understanding of what is going on inside the body and then adjust the treatment plan accordingly. So a good example of that, as is written in the Manual of Acupuncture here, stasis of heart blood gives rise to pain along the heart channel in the arm or throat. So that is a traditional way of depicting essentially the referral pain that one gets down their arm when they're having a heart attack. So this is the way they explain that the disease is manifesting in the channel. So the disease can also transmit in the channel, so it can jump from one channel to another. If it's a form of hot or cold chi that's gotten in, then it can turn cold can eventually become heat if it's in the body for too long, strangely enough, and then that can manifest by showing as different colors in the body too. So this is one of the ways that we determine what kind of influence has gotten into the body. So if it's if we've got blueness, then there'll be cold. If there's redness, then there'll be heat. So number 4, the channels serve to transmit chi to the diseased area. So in this way, you can stimulate an acupuncture point on the channel and it will transmit the chi in the blood throughout that whole channel, sending chi and blood to different areas of the body in order to heal disease. We have the lower connecting channels. So these spread from the lower connecting point of their own channel to connect with their externally paired channel. After joining their paired channel, they follow their own pathways. So these are the channels that connect the yin and yang channels. So for example, we've got the lung channel and then the large intestine channel. So the lung is a yin channel and a yin organ. The large intestine is a yang channel and yang organ. The lower connecting point on both of those channels connects those channels. Then we have the minute collaterals. This comes from the observation of small vessels on the surface of the body where the larger channels and collaterals branch off to even more minute channels so chi and blood can reach every part of the body. And then finally we've got the sinew channels. So these do not penetrate the internal organs. They're essentially the same. They follow the same course of the channel, but they're broader, and they can themselves become diseased, and you can treat them kind of separately to the primary channel itself, or the internal channel. And these channels they essentially follow the major lines of the muscle and the fascia pathways. Now, taking what we've looked at so far with the explanation of what the functions of the channels are, we're going to have a look at some of the physiological systems and compare them to the functions of the channels. So we've got the nervous system, which maintains conditions within limits that are required to maintain life, homeostasis. It regulates the operation of internal organs, regulates bodily activities by responding rapidly using nerve impulses. It is responsible for our perceptions, behaviors, and memories, and it initiates all voluntary movements. So we've got the central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord, processes incoming sensory information. It's the source of our thoughts, emotions, and memories. Most signals that stimulate muscles to contract and glands to secrete originate in the central nervous system. Then we have the peripheral nervous system, which consists of the cranial and spinal nerves, the somatic nervous system, autonomic nervous system, which consists of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Then we have the enteric nervous system, which is our digestive tract. Functions of the nervous system include sensory, integrative, and motor. So sensory receptors detect internal and external stimuli, which are transmitted to the brain and spinal cord through cranial and spinal nerves. The nervous system analyzes and processes sensory information for appropriate responses, integration. And the motor function, effectors in the form of muscle contraction and gland secretion elicit an appropriate response through cranial and spinal nerves. Now, if we compare that to some of the functions of the channels, all organs, sense organs, and tissues are energized and warmed by the chi and blood circulating through the channel network. Organs are linked by internal parts of the channels. Sounds very similar to what part of the nervous system is doing. Now we have the cardiovascular system. It transports and distributes blood throughout the body to deliver materials such as oxygen, nutrients, and hormones, and to carry away waste products. It consists of the heart, blood vessels, arteries, and veins. Blood vessels form a closed system of tubes that carries blood away from the heart, transports it to the tissues of the body, and then returns it to the heart. In a comparison to the functions of the channels, transporting qi and blood throughout the body and rendering the body an integrated whole. So the Chinese did have a concept of circulation, although as we discovered before, it was reflected from an agricultural perspective through the control and conservation of water through streams and channels. So they had their yang channels and their yin channels, which moved throughout the body. So yang channels go one way and yin channels go the other. It's very similar to what you would think of the cardiovascular system, in that the arteries are taking blood away from the heart and the venous system is bringing blood back to the heart. So if you're not familiar with it, there's something called an anastomosis in the body. It's where two branches of an artery unify and supply the same region. So they provide alternative routes for blood to reach a tissue or organ, and can act as an alternative supply of blood when an artery is compromised, preventing a loss of blood to an area. They can also occur between veins and between arterioles and venules. And if we look at what the ancient Chinese or acupuncture, traditional Chinese medicine, says about something very similar, the minute collaterals are essentially an observation of a very similar thing, even though it was not likely that you can see an anastomosis with your eyes, naked eye. It's the concept is there, that there are mini venules and arterioles that are supplying different regions of the body. Now we have the lymphatic system. Consists of lymph fluid, lymphatic vessels that transport lymph fluid, lymphatic tissue containing lymphocytes, B cells and T cells, and red bone marrow. So it assists in circulating body fluids and helps defend the body against disease-causing agents. Most components of blood plasma filter through blood capillary walls to form interstitial fluid, which then passes into lymphatic vessels. Once this occurs, the fluid is called lymph. Let's have a look at a comparison. The various kinds of channels occupy different depths within the body. As well as nourishing and energizing these different layers of the body, the channels serve to prevent the penetration of pathogenic factors that may attack the body from the outside. It sounds very similar to the function of what lymphatic fluid and the lymphatic system is doing. Then we have the integumentary system, our skin. Helps to maintain a constant body temperature, protects the body and provides sensory information about the surrounding environment. Its location makes it vulnerable to infection, disease, and injury, yet its protective features protect the body from microbial invasion. It is also where we sweat from. A comparison to the acupuncture channels, the entire channel system serves as a series of barriers to prevent the deeper penetration of pathogenic factors from the exterior. Very similar, once again, to what skin does. This is from the Anatomy and Physiology textbook. Skin reflects our emotions in our expression and flushing of the face. Changes in skin color reflect homeostatic imbalances in the body. So we've got blue skin when there is hypoxia, red skin with inflammation, yellow skin with jaundice, and all sorts of other different colors that the body manifests when things are not usually going as planned. Of course, with traditional Chinese medicine, this happens as well. Disease of the Zhang Fu are reflected onto the channels. That is definitely an integral part of the diagnosis process in traditional Chinese medicine. If someone comes in and they're blue, it usually means that there's a cold attacking the body. If they're red, then there's heat, and so on. Then the fascia system, described as the most pervasive tissue in the body, from superficial fascia that is loosely knit, fibroelastic tissue that is woven into the undersurface of the skin, to deep fascia, which varies in density and compartmentalizes the body, surrounding and separating visceral organs. The deepest layers of fascia, subserous fascia, intimately surrounds and lubricates the internal organs. So the epimysium, perimysium, and endomysium are projections of deep fascia that encase the muscle and contribute to the development of muscle tension. Muscle and fascia are functionally linked, called myofascia, with fascia contributing to the overall contour of the body and lubrication between structures for movement and nutrition. Vessels and nerves are also insulated and carried through the fascia network, contributing to homeostasis. If you're not familiar with this ubiquitous tissue, I highly recommend you do some reading about it. It's very interesting. So here we have a rendition I've done for you of skeletal muscle. So we've got the tendon, so this attaches to the bone, then it comes into skeletal muscle. So around the skeletal muscle, we have the epimysium, so that's a layer that surrounds that. Then within the skeletal muscle, So this is the body of the muscle here. We've got the muscle fascicle that comes out. What surrounds the muscle fascicle is the perimysium. And then from the fascicle, we have the muscle fiber, which comes out here. And the muscle fiber is then surrounded by the endomysium. And then from the muscle fiber, we have the myofibrils, which are surrounded by the sarcolemma. So you can see it's this step-down process of this continuation and repetition where everything is surrounded by this all-pervasive fascia. The epimysium, perimysium, and endomysium, sarcolemma, they're all just continuations of the one type of connective tissue, same as the tendon. So the fascia system, its numerous connective tissues and products, creates a continuum, an organ of form. It creates an entire scaffolding of the body from the basal layer of skin to the fibrous cloth-like layers that surround and invest in the muscles and organs, and the leathery substrate of cartilage and bones. The fascia system proposed the idea that the human body is one organ with multiple compartments, as opposed to multiple sections that make up a whole as depicted in dissection. So I apologize for any vegans out there or vegetarians who are confronted by the sight of meat. Just giving you a warning, this is not gory, it's just a piece of steak that I later ate. But I needed to get some of my own photos of what fascia and this connective tissue is. So here you can see this web-like structure here. If you do eat meat, you can cut a steak open and see this for yourself. Just pull it apart a bit and you can see all these spiderweb projections. So this is the fascia. This is the stuff that the epimysium, perimysium, and endomysium are all made of. It's this hydrated web structure that is throughout all of the body and allows us to allows different structures to communicate with each other. It's pretty interesting if you read up on it. They're considering this to be like a second nervous system in the way that it communicates, but it does it through tension instead of nerve impulses. Very interesting stuff. And of course, for the vegan and vegetarian option, we have an orange. This is essentially the same concept. We're a bunch of bags walking around made up of proteins and collagen with substances in them, but essentially we're mostly water. And that's what an orange is. If you squish, or a lemon or any type of fruit, if you squish it all down together, you get the pulp, which takes up a very small percentage of the actual full, the total structure of the orange. So this here is akin to the fascia that separates all of our muscle fibers, our muscles and organs. This is what these divides here do for the orange and for fruit as well. And for a comparison of the channels, we have the sinew channels. So they do not penetrate the Zhangfu. They broadly follow the course of their associated primary channels, but are wider. They are more superficial and follow the lines of major muscles, muscle groups, tendons, and ligaments. They reflect disturbances of the primary channels and can be injured themselves. Sounds very similar to the network now known as fascia. So what does all of this mean? Are we to take all of this information and bring together some kind of conclusion that an ancient culture in the world had more knowledge about the human body than we do now, and we're only just catching up to this mysterious form of medicine? Or is it more likely that they had a very sophisticated way of understanding the body for the time that they developed it, and they were drawing vast conclusions based on their limited anatomical and physiological knowledge of the era? And that is why there are similarities to what we're discovering now, because they were smart people. They spent a lot of time thinking about this, studying it with what they knew. It's probably more likely the latter, is that there was a very sophisticated perspective of the body, and any similarities that are drawn with modern medical science are, I mean, they're beyond coincidence, but it's an inevitable eventuation of a culture studying the body as intently as the Chinese did and coming to these conclusions. So I think that what happens is, when an ancient culture comes up with a perspective of the body, and then that is written down and reinvented and reinterpreted and somewhat distorted over the centuries from which it was first thought of, it creates this mysterium about it that they knew more, and we're still trying to catch up with them. There are mysteries that we're still figuring out because they were lost to the ages. More likely, the mysteries are that they just didn't know all of the answers, and they were trying to build a picture of the body with what they knew. And that mystery is really just lack of knowledge, which we're now filling in all the gaps. I also say that with the utmost respect, because the reality is we have to look at the culture that we get the modern day acupuncture from, and there are people who were bloodletting, were cutting people open to get rid of evil chi and appeasing ancestors that were coming through the airwaves and wreaking all of this havoc on them. I mean, this is the minds of an ancient culture that was the origins of acupuncture. So why is it that if we get rid of the things that seem silly to us now, we're still left with these traditional concepts that we revere as the makings of amazing medical practitioners? Why do we get rid of some things and keep the rest? Most likely because the things that we keep still work. They still maintain a benefit. I mean, you can basically give acupuncture to someone based on any kind of concept or theory, and I believe it's still going to work. Whether you say that there's an evil chi that it's invaded the body, whether it's cold, whether it's because there's inflammation and the application of a needle into the body causes an immune response, and that's the way that acupuncture works. I think if you take away all of the explanations, you're left with the needle and the human body. You put the needle in the body and it will cause a response. So I think to start to bring this to a conclusion, we need to think about the natural functions of the body versus conceptual perceptions, which is what essentially a lot of the ancient Chinese medicine is based on. They were concepts based on Taoist philosophy, yin and yang, and the natural world applied to the anatomy and physiology of the body. And because there was not innate knowledge of legitimate anatomy, this is the way they got through it, drawing conclusions from other philosophies that they knew. We now know that there's a lot of other functions and mechanisms going on in the body, and it's about making an informed decision about how we want to perceive what is actually happening when we put an acupuncture needle into the body. Is it moving stagnant chi, or is it creating a cascade of physiological mechanisms that is resulting in a very measurable and repeatable response? So these are some of the questions I would just like to leave hanging here at the end of the first part. And final contemplation: as students of a contemporary scientific discipline, no matter what that is, whether you're an acupuncturist or if you're another healthcare practitioner coming to learn about acupuncture, can we genuinely propose that there exists a system of channels that deviates from the visible and proven anatomy and physiology of the human body? So that's it for now. I'm going to leave that question hanging in the air and be looking forward to seeing you in part 2 of New Perspectives on Qi and the Channels, which is Mastering the Mysteries. We're going to be looking at all of my favorite aspects of the body, learning about the anatomy and physiology, and about how essentially acupuncture works on a neurological level. So don't forget, if you're aiming to get formal CPD points for this course, click on the link below, complete the course, and then follow the instructions, and we will send out the certificate for you. And make sure to have a look at the other courses that are available on Point Pro. So I'll leave you there. That's the end of part 1 of New Perspectives on Qi and the Channel. Thank you for watching and listening, and I'll see you over in part 2.